Address.
I'm Jane Norman, a political reporter with ABC News and a director here at the club. Everyone, if I can just grab your attention, it is all starting. Welcome to today's press club, to the press club and today's Westpac address. I'm Jane Norman, a political reporter at ABC and a director here at the club. Our guest today is Australia's Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek, who is releasing the State of the Environment report, a report that had been gathering dust on her predecessor's desk. Now, if this is a report card, we are failing miserably. All aspects of the environment are under pressure, the report says, and many are declining. Australia has suffered catastrophic losses of wildlife and habitat, and in fact, we've lost the most mammals of any continent. Now, if anyone had been doubting or questioning the level of interest in this issue, I'm reliably informed that this is our fastest selling event of the year so far. Now, if anyone is watching at home, and for those in the room, you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @PressClubAust and the hashtag is NPC. Please welcome Tanya Plibersek.
Well, thank you so much, Jane, and thanks to the Press Club. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. First Nations peoples have the oldest continuing cultures on Earth and are the world's most successful environmental custodians. They've managed land and sea country for 65,000 years, and as the Minister for Environment and Water, I'm committed to learning from this remarkable example. Thank you so much to the Press Club for having me here today. I want to acknowledge the report's three lead authors who join us today, Professor Emma Johnson, Dr Terry Janke and Dr Ian Creswell. I also want to acknowledge the Chief Scientist, Professor Ian Chubb, and my parliamentary colleagues, Michelle Rowland, Senator Pocock, and my old friend Chris Hayes, who's come back to Canberra today. It's been just 6 weeks since I started in this portfolio, and on top of the usual mountain of departmental briefings, I've used these 6 weeks to travel to some of the most remarkable parts of Australia, reminding me again how grateful I am to live in the most beautiful country on earth, and how thankful I am to the generations of activists and good governments who have protected our unique national, natural and cultural heritage. But there's another story here too, a difficult, confronting and sometimes depressing story. At the same time as I've been seeing some of the most beautiful places on earth, I've been reading the data that tells me that these places are under threat. If we continue on the trajectory that we are on, the precious places, landscapes, animals and plants that we think of when we think of home may not be here for our kids and grandkids. Today, as part of my statutory duty as Minister, I am publicly releasing the 2021 State of the Environment report. It's one of the most important documents in environmental science. Every 5 years, a group of independent experts, some of Australia's most respected scientists, a number of whom are with us here today, are given access to the best available tools. They're told to show us the full national picture of the health of our environment. Or as one of the authors put it, take a good hard look at ourselves. This report was delivered to the government last year. The previous minister, Susan Ley, received it before Christmas but chose to keep it hidden, locked away until after the federal election. And when you read it, you'll know why. But while it's a confronting read, Australians deserve the truth. We deserve to know that Australia has lost more mammal species to extinction than any other continent. We deserve to know that threatened communities have grown by 20% in the last 5 years, with places literally burned into endangerment by catastrophic fires. We need to know that the Murray-Darling fell to its lowest water level on record in 2019, and that for the first time, Australia now has more foreign plant species than native ones. Individually, every one of these revelations is dreadful, but it's only when you think about the cumulative impact that you begin to get the full picture of environmental decline. It's right there on page 1 of the report. I quote, "Overall, the state and trend of the environment in Australia are poor and deteriorating, with abrupt changes in ecological systems being recorded in the past 5 years. And it's downhill from there. Since the last report, marine heat waves have caused mass coral bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef. Warming temperatures have reduced kelp beds along the southeast coast, as well as threatening reef habitats and the abalone and lobster industries that they support. At the same time, Australia is experiencing a plague of marine plastics. In Perth, scientists have found up to 60,000 pieces of plastic per square kilometre of water. In Brisbane, they found between 40,000 and 80,000. At the top end, in the Torres Strait and Timor Sea, abandoned fishing gear has been killing marine animals on an industrial scale. These underwater hurricanes of debris are known as ghost nets, and they're strangling up to 14,000 turtles a year, turtles which are listed as threatened. Our waters are struggling, and so is the land. As a result of erosion, deforestation, intensive agriculture and climate change, Australia's soil is now generally in poor condition, and it's getting worse. We're losing topsoil, letting it blow away without vegetation to protect it, making our soil less productive, less fertile and less efficient in holding water, which means our agricultural output is lower than it could be. Our land is more susceptible to drought, and our soil's ability to regenerate and support life is diminished. Australia is one of the world's deforestation hotspots. Between the year 2000 and 2017, Australia cleared over 7.7 million hectares of threatened species habitat across the country. That's an area bigger than Tasmania. Much of this clearing occurred in small increments. In fact, more than 90% of it was never assessed under our environmental laws. When we destroy these habitats and when we don't restore them elsewhere, endangered creatures lose their homes, and that has consequences. In February this year, koalas were officially moved from threatened to endangered in Queensland, New South Wales and the ACT. These drowsy creatures have grazed on Australian eucalypt for more than 25 million years, and it's only this year, of all years, that they've become endangered. Of course, this disturbing list is made worse by climate change. Global warming multiplies environmental pressures everywhere. It heats our oceans, it deepens droughts, it intensifies disease, it destroys habitats, and it worsens extreme weather events, which tilt the balance of ecosystems beyond recognition. The bushfires of 2019 and 2020 are still being felt today. Those bushfires were an ecological bomb ripping through southeastern Australia. They killed or displaced up to 3 billion creatures. They burnt over 80% of the Greater Blue Mountains area, almost 60% of our Gondwana rainforests, and more than 40% of the Stirling Range National Park. And they tipped clouds of sediment and ash into our waterways, leading to mass marine deaths. That summer was terrifying for anyone who lived through it. And if we don't act, those awful red nights will become more common. That's just a taste of what this report lays out. And for 6 months, it sat on the previous minister's desk. As Professor Emma Johnson told the Sydney Morning Herald in April, quote, "We've put a huge amount of effort and hard yakka into this, and we really hope the report can be used for long-term planning, immediate action, for changing our investments. But we can't start that work until the report is released." Well, I agree, and I agree that it's well past time we get to work. As we see from the State of the Environment report, the previous government was no friend to the environment. Too many urgent warnings were either ignored or kept secret. But there are other failures too. The former government made nice promises but rarely bothered to deliver them. For example, the previous government had a decade to fulfil the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. It's a good plan, Labor made it, we delivered it, and it saved the river system from dying in 2019. But it's yet to be fully implemented. By the time the Morrison government left office, they had delivered just 2 of the promised 450 gigalitres of environmental water. Just 2 gigalitres of a promised 450. And there was no plan to find the other 448 gigalitres by 2024 when it's due. The former government promised $40 million for Indigenous water, of which they never delivered a drop. The Morrison government made a series of pledges on recycling, pledges that the Labor government broadly supports. I think most Australians would be really shocked to know just how far we are from meeting these targets, and that the former government had no real plan for getting there. Again and again, the former government behaved in a way that undermined public trust in environmental management. They gave a private charity almost $500 million without tender or process to guide our response to the crisis in the Great Barrier Reef. It actually doesn't matter how good an organisation is. No one should walk in to the Prime Minister's office and leave with hundreds of millions of dollars they didn't even ask for. For 9 years, the previous government oversaw a broken, barely regulated national water market. The ACCC found that it was a market with no rules against insider trading, no requirements to keep proper records. This led to widespread distrust in the system. And as well as this distrust, there was willful damage inflicted as well. From Tony Abbott to Scott Morrison, from Barnaby Joyce to Matt Canavan, the Liberals and Nationals came to power with a mission to put the environment last, to repeal climate legislation and to slash emissions reduction targets. They cut funding to the Environment Department by 40%. And they thought that was pretty clever until they saw what it did in practice. Without proper funding, environmental decision times exploded. According to a National Audit Office review in 2020, the average federal decision for a new project was 116 days behind schedule. And of these decisions, around 80% were either non-compliant or contained errors. The previous government's funding cuts held back business, they damaged the economy, and they undermined practical efforts to protect our environment. In 2018, the former government cut the highly protected areas of Commonwealth marine parks in half, removing the largest area from conservation in Australian history. The Liberals and Nationals spent less than $17 million of the $216 million they promised to upgrade Kakadu National Park's infrastructure. And in their final term, the Morrison government's relationship with the traditional owners of Kakadu broke down completely, to the point where a government review, co-chaired by Amanda Vanstone, called it, quote, deplorable and untenable. The previous government was told, loud and clear, that Australian environmental laws were not working, and they did nothing to fix that. Almost 2 years ago, the Morrison government received an official review into the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. It was written by Graham Samuel, and the message was as blunt as the State of the Environment report. To quote Professor Samuel, "The EPBC Act is outdated and requires fundamental reform. The EPBC Act is ineffective. It does not enable the Commonwealth to effectively protect environmental matters that are important for the nation. It is not fit to address current or future environmental challenges." I'm continuing to quote Professor Samuel, "The resounding message that I heard through the review is that Australians do not trust that the Act is delivering for the environment, for business or for the community." Professor Samuel's work was thorough, but it wasn't a revelation. The federal government has been receiving the same message for years now. And the central theme, over and over again, is around trust and integrity. People don't trust that the Commonwealth is protecting the environment. They don't trust the development application process to be smooth, on time, or without unnecessary duplication. And frankly, that scepticism is justified. Under the current laws, we don't clearly define the environmental outcomes we're trying to deliver. When we make environmental decisions, we don't ensure that they're being enforced in practice. And even if we wanted to, we don't have the data or resources to do it properly. And because no one trusts the system, these processes are often duplicated by state and federal governments, which delays projects, drives up business costs and jeopardises investment. And of course, at the same time, our environment just isn't getting the protection that it needs. That's what Graham Samuel told us. There's an almost universal consensus that change is needed. Indeed, business and environmental groups very maturely put aside differences to back Professor Samuel's recommendations, but again, the Morrison government chose to ignore that. They tried to ram through a select few changes and instead delivered nothing. That's the situation I'm inheriting as Environment and Water Minister. Years of warnings ignored or kept secret, promises made but not delivered, dodgy behaviour undermining public confidence, brutal funding cuts, willful neglect, laws that don't work to protect the environment or smooth the way for sensible development, all against a backdrop of accelerating environmental destruction. It's time to change that. Australia's environment is bad and getting worse, as this report shows, and much of the destruction outlined in the State of the Environment report will take years to turn around. Nevertheless, I am optimistic about the steps that we can take over the next 3 years. Legislating strong action on climate change is a great start. Australian scientists are world-class. We know so much about how we restore landscapes, repair coral reefs and recover threatened species. We've got thousands of volunteers out there every weekend planting trees, collecting rubbish and cleaning up their local creek, many of them through community land care groups. Australians really care about the landscapes they live in and about the precious places that they'll never visit but want protected anyway. They just need a government that cares as much as they do, which is why in this term of government I will be guided by 3 essential goals: to protect, to restore and to manage Australia's environment. We need to protect our environment and heritage for the future. We need to restore environments that have already been damaged, and we need to actively manage our landscapes, oceans and waterways and the critical places that we've vowed to protect so they don't become run down through neglect. That's our agenda. To offer proper protection, we need to set clear environmental standards with explicit targets around what we value as a country and what our laws need to protect. This will require a fundamental reform of our national environmental laws and empowering a new environmental protection agency to enforce them. We need trust and transparency. Decisions need to be built on good data to show the public how we're tracking in real time, data that can be shared so we don't keep collecting the same information again and again, but instead we build over time a useful, usable, rich picture of our environment. We also need certainty and efficiency. This will allow us to speed up most processes so we can build new housing, construct renewable energy projects, lay the roads that connect our communities, better environmental outcomes and faster, clearer decisions. For too long, people have seen these goals as mutually exclusive. They're not. They're not. Good environmental law is also good economic reform. That's why, by agreement with the Treasurer, the historic wellbeing budget will also include environmental indicators. As the Treasurer said recently, it's really important that we measure what matters in our economy, in addition to all of the traditional measures, not instead of, but in addition to. Because this is not a conflict between jobs and the environment. We have got to go beyond that thinking when we reform our environmental laws. To help guide that change, I'm announcing that by the end of the year, the Australian Government will formally respond to the Samuel Review. We'll then develop new environmental legislation for 2023. We'll consult thoroughly on environmental standards. But in the meantime, I want to see an immediate start on improving our environmental data and regional planning, establishing a shared view around what needs to be protected and restored, the areas where development can occur with minimal consequences. I'm not naive. I know that improving our environmental laws is going to be challenging. People will have very different ideas about what national environmental standards should look like. And as Minister, I will probably make some calls that some people disagree with. But I am absolutely determined to improve the system. The truth is that everyone will have to give a bit to achieve real, lasting national progress. It's encouraging to know that groups with very different interests work to find common ground during the Samuel Review. Business, industry, environmentalists, scientists, traditional owners, farmers, unions and your standard keen bushwalker like me came to the table to see what kind of progress could be made. I want to work across the board to build on that goodwill because ambition is really important, but it's not much good without achievement. I understand that campaigns to stop individual projects will motivate and energise some people. Others will want to focus on a particular species or a particularly beautiful place. I know these campaigns can capture the public imagination, but in my judgment, what the environment really needs is a changed system. That's the message from the Samuel Review. That's the message from the State of the Environment report. Without structural change, we'll be resigning ourselves to another decade of failure without the tools we need to arrest our decline. We all want to pass on a healthy environment to our children and grandchildren. And that's why I'm also happy to announce today that we will expand Australia's national estate. Our government will set a goal of protecting 30% of our land and 30% of our oceans by 2030. We'll explore the creation of new national parks and marine protected areas, including by pursuing the East Antarctic Marine Park. This will be the latest chapter in a very proud Labor story. Labor protected Kakadu, the Daintree, the Great Barrier Reef, Antarctica and the Tasmanian World Heritage Area. And as Minister, I intend to add to that legacy. The State of the Environment report also makes it clear that we have to do a better job of repairing environmental damage. Too much clearing of habitat has already occurred. Too many ecosystems and species are under threat. We can't just stop future destruction, although this is essential and the most cost-effective way to address the environmental crisis. We also need to actively repair past damage. The Australian Land Conservation Alliance estimates that we need to spend over $1 billion a year to restore and prevent further landscape degradation. The scale of this challenge means that governments can't do it alone. We need to work with industry and with philanthropic partners, many of whom are already doing terrific work. I want to look at ways of making this investment easier to support land-based carbon projects that deliver biodiversity, improve drought resilience and drive agricultural productivity, and to ensure that we prioritise the most important areas for ecological restoration. Better data, laws that focus on outcomes and good regional planning will help protect and restore the places with the greatest carbon and biodiversity value. We'll also support investment in blue carbon projects, restoration of mangroves, tidal marshes and seagrasses that provide habitat for marine life, support our fisheries and protect our coastlines from rising waters and storm surges. An Australian scientist described these places as the blue diamond of carbon storage. And he's right, these environments are precious, absorbing carbon at up to 5 times the rate of tropical rainforests and storing it for thousands of years. The state of the environment also tells us the urgent need to better manage our waste and to actively manage the places that we have vowed to protect. These are areas of clear community interest. Most people want to reduce their plastics footprint. They want to recycle the things that they've used, and they want a government to help them do it as easily as possible. I'm really genuinely excited by our prospects here. We can reduce pollution, we can increase recycling, and we can support local manufacturing at the same time. Just recently, for example, I visited the Samsara lab at the Australian National University, where researchers are using enzymes to break down plastics so that they can infinitely recycle those molecules to make new plastic. I've seen the research the University of Technology in Sydney is doing on making plastics out of algae. It's really fascinating work, and these are just a couple of the examples of the brilliant science that's being done around the country. I want to support these efforts to replace petrochemical products while working with the states and territories to encourage a circular economy. That means promoting recycling, reusing and repairing as much as possible. We know how important this issue is to our friends in the Pacific. At the UN's Oceans Conference last month, our Pacific family told me about the impacts that plastics are having on their health, their environment and their livelihoods. It's an area where Australia can forge really strong regional partnerships. As I said to the Pacific leaders, I want to see a plastics-free Pacific in our lifetime. Every Pacific leader I've spoken with is eager to work with Australia on this project, to share what we know with each other. There's also the question of managing the land that we've promised to protect. Here I see the environment and water portfolio absolutely going hand in hand with Labor's reconciliation agenda. First Nations Australians have managed this country for 65,000 years, and they did it through changing seasons, shifting climates and across radically different environments. These systems of environmental knowledge have been passed down for thousands of generations, and any modern conservation program should incorporate them. And that's why the Labor government will double the number of Indigenous ranges by the end of the decade to 3,800, and will significantly increase funding for Indigenous protected areas. We'll deliver the $40 million of Indigenous water promised by the Morrison government in 2018 but never produced, and will make it easier for First Nations Australians to protect their cultural heritage. We've committed to introduce standalone cultural heritage legislation. which we'll co-design with the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance. A healthy environment sits at the heart of our national legacy, and it feeds our national soul. Our sense of ourselves, our health as a society is bound up with the health of our land and our water. Australians know how lucky we are to live in this country. It's the feeling that you get when you're coming home after a time away. You see it with fresh eyes and fresh appreciation. The crystal blue sky, clearer than anywhere else in the world, the glimmer and sparkle of Sydney Harbour, the long green stretches of National Park bordering our cities, the perfect ring of beaches that meet the sea, or the corrugated red ridges of Central Australia. Every time, that same feeling, that feeling of home stirring inside us. That's our natural heritage. That's what we're committed to protecting. In 2022, Australians voted for the environment, they voted for action on climate change, they voted for their children and their grandchildren and every generation of Australians who will follow us. When you change the government, you change the country. After a lost decade, after a decade of going backwards, we can't waste another minute. Thank you.